Gwen Arajuo, a 17-year-old trans woman, was brutally murdered simply for the crime of being who she was. She was left decomposed in a shallow grave in a national forest 3 hours away from her home in Newark, California. Those responsible would laugh and joke as they stopped for McDonald's breakfast on the way home in the early morning light. But it would take multiple trials for these murderers to be brought to justice. Prejudice, bigotry, and the cry of trans panic would shield these murderers. But it would not be long until they would face their judgment. On this episode of California True Crime, The Murder of Gwen Arajuo, Where's the Truth? Welcome to another episode of California True Crime. As with the other episodes in this series, I'm Charles, and I will be leading us through this last installment of the murder of Gwen Arajuo. And with me, as always, are Jessica and Sean. How are you guys both this evening?
Good.
I'm doing good.
Just a quick note, if you haven't listened to the other 4 parts of this series, we really recommend that you stop now, download those episodes, and start there before you listen to this one. Also, as with all of the other episodes in this series, we are talking about some sensitive issues or issues that might have a triggering effect on some. So just a warning before we start. If you're listening to this with small children, you might want to put your headphones in or skip this one and come back to it later. Up to this point, we have talked about a lot of different things. We started off this series by talking about some of the history of the fight for transgender rights in California and how California was really at the forefront of a lot of those fights, even before places like Stonewall. We already talked a lot about Gwen Arajuo's early life and leading up to her death, as well as the actual crime itself and the first trial, which you'll remember ended in a mistrial. We also, if you listened to our last episode, know that we talked about the article that was written by one of the jurors, and really we got a kind of a insider view of what went on at that trial, which brings us up to this episode, which will focus really on the second trial. If you remember, the first trial ended in a mistrial, and the prosecution did immediately plan to retry them. We have talked about the crime and the initial trial. This episode, we're going to focus on the different stories that defendants will tell at the second trial and how that might have affected their sentencing. This episode, we will basically tell the same story that we have in the last couple of episodes, but this time from the perspective of the murderers. The information from this episode comes from court documents that detail the testimony of the 3 defendants from their second trial. Either of you have any questions before we get started?
So they actually testify in this trial.
Yeah, and that was a little different if you remember from the first trial. That we know that the majority of the prosecution's witness, Jaron Neighbors, Nicole Brown, even Paul and Manny Morel, but we didn't hear a lot from the main defendants. That's not going to be the case in this one. I couldn't really find a reason why at this point they kind of broke their code of silence where they didn't necessarily in the first one. I think maybe they realized that having a mistrial in one case was possible, but going through that same thing after the time and the press on this case, I think they were starting to look at it as every man for themselves. We're going to start first with Jason Caceres' testimony of the events that transpired that horrible night. I do want to make note that Caceres is going to have the same defense attorney, Tony Serra, on his side. If you remember, Serra was one of the main reasons I think that the prosecution's case was kind of pulled apart. He really went at the prosecution's witnesses extremely hard and according to the jurors, put a lot of holes in them. During this second trial, Caceres' testimony actually from the earlier trial will be read to the jury as part of the prosecution's case. So you remember, Caceres did testify, but his testimony was really I won't say it wasn't really detailed. What is to follow comes from his new testimony from the second trial. So Caceres says that he is going to go to 2 bars with Michael Madsen, Jose Morel, and Jaron Neighbors on the night of October 3rd. He says that the question of Gwen's assigned gender at birth never came up at all. It wasn't even a topic of conversation. He will also say that it was at Jose Morel's house that he discovered that Gwen was assigned male at birth, and that he stopped Michael Madsen, Jose Morel, and Jaron Neighbors several times from beating Gwen. So right there, we notice that's a little bit different than the original. In the original, remember, Jaron Neighbors' testimony says that they had talked about this a few times before, that it had come up with Paul Morel. This time, Jason Caceres is saying, no, we didn't talk about it at all. It was never a thing. Once he stops them from beating Gwen, he goes outside to smoke a cigarette. He comes back in 15 or 20 minutes later. He then sees Jose cleaning the floor and Michael Madsen standing next to him. Gwen's nowhere in the room. At this point, Jaron Neighbors comes in from the garage and states that Gwen is in fact dead and they need to get rid of the body. So already we're seeing a complete shift from the first trial with all of the onus being now, it seems like, almost being put on Jaron Neighbors, that he's the person that killed her. Caceres will say it's Michael Madsen's idea for he and Neighbors to go to Caceres' house for the shovels, and by the time they got back, Jose Morel was cleaning the floor and crying. Gwen's body was in the garage, wrapped in a blanket. At this point, the men all load the body and drove to the dump site. So this is not, I will say it's not 180 degrees from the original trial, but there is some big differences for me. I think this one, he firmly points the finger at Jaron Neighbors, which to me is kind of in the same vein as his defense attorney from the first trial.
I just think with how many times we've heard the story and stuff like this, even right then when Gwen is murdered, there's so much more afterwards that they do. Instead of going, oh no, they do so much more that shows that what they did was horrible and they knew it. Like, they're not innocent. Their defense is not good on any of it.
No, and I think I really do think that this one was we're still holding on to the phantoms from the first case of they're all claiming, I didn't kill her. I helped cover her up. I helped bury the body. I helped dispose of her. I helped, I lied to the cops, that kind of stuff. But I didn't kill her. That's so much better. Well, great. If you're saying you didn't kill him, but you're pointing the finger at somebody else, but you still covered for that other person. So yeah, I have a really hard time with this. Some of these versions of the story. We already know it's terrible. So next, now that we have Caceres' story out of the way, we're going to move on to Jose Morel's testimony. Now, I will say this before we get into this, that I think, again, if you've listened to our other episode, if you've followed this with us, that Jose Morel's is kind of a smack dab in the center of this entire thing. Morel will say that when he met Gwen, he found her attractive and he had one sexual encounter with her. He says that she tells him that she's menstruating, and that's the reason for no vaginal sex. He will also then go on to say, a few days before October 4th, that he and the others had a conversation about whether Gwen was a man or a woman. So right there, he's contradicting Jason Caceres' story. Jason says, no, we didn't talk about it at all. Jose's like, no, we did. We did talk about it. He goes on to say that Paul, his brother, Jose's brother, is going to imply to them that he knew that she was assigned female at birth, and Jose believes him. And this comes from his implication. Jose says, well, Paul kind of implied that he had sex with Gwen. So before we go on, I want to take a little second to talk about this first part of his testimony, because he does spend a lot of time on the stand almost justifying why he had sex with Gwen. And I think, it goes back to what we've talked about in the past or in the other episodes about this implied homophobia and transphobia of he's so worried that somebody will, it seems to me that he is so worried that somebody will see him as gay that he has to explain it in a court of law. And I find that reprehensible. We're talking about the murder of a girl, and it's almost like he's still trying to say, I'm not gay, I'm not gay.
It's interesting too, because it speaks, I think, to premeditation. I mean, that they're even being asked about this.
Right.
And in the Caceres testimony, I would kind of understand why he would say, no, we hadn't talked about this, because that was kind of a big part
100%.
of it. Was this planned? Did you guys rile each other up? That kind of thing. But this really blows that out of the water when he's saying, yeah, we did talk about it. So it feels like, I just don't know how this testimony is helping anyone.
I don't. And that's where, when you read it and you see some of the articles in the papers and them spending a lot of time, or Jose spending a lot of time on this question of him having sex with Gwen. And I really think that speaks to that inherent homophobia within how he looks at it, and then maybe the peer group around him. Like Caceres, though, he will testify that he had been drinking throughout October 3rd and 4th and was fully drunk when they returned to the Morel house. He'll also admit that he'd smoked marijuana that night as well. He also says that the four men did not discuss Gwen's gender at all that evening. So he's saying, well, we talked about it before, but we didn't really talk about it that night when we were out drinking. He says Gwen, Nicole Brown, Paul Morel, and Manny Morel, Jose's brothers, were all at the house when the four men returned. There is no mention of anyone else being at the party at this time. Remember, they do get back to the house about 1:30 a.m. I bring up the fact that no one else was mentioned because there are other reports circulating in some of the news sources and even some of the rumors that there were way more people at this house than had originally been testified to. So Jose will say that Gwen was acting in a way that was annoying to him. He asks Gwen whether she was a man or woman and why she preferred anal sex. He will say that he did not believe that she was a trans woman at this point. He was surprised that she did not deny anything at that time. He asks her 2 more times. This time he says he raised his voice. Madsen, Caceres, and neighbors all began asking her the same questions. And it was at this time that Michael Madsen reached out and tried to grab her genitalia as they went to the bathroom. He does not say that she went willingly or if Madsen forced her, but I think it's safe to assume that Gwen would never have went willingly. And given the state of these 4 guys in the house and the alcohol and already being confronted with these questions.
Well, and in neighbor's testimony in the trial before, he made it pretty clear that, she tried to leave, to smoke a cigarette, to get out of the situation, and they wouldn't let her.
Yeah, a few times. And I think this goes back to this question that we talked about before about the assault, the rape, and the idea of kidnapping. I think this is their version of it, right? So they're saying they're trying to lessen their impact, or well, I don't know if she went willingly or not. Almost trying to fool themselves into thinking like, what person would go willingly, right? Jose will then describe how he began to wonder if he might be gay. So again, he's bringing up this idea that he can't believe he's gay. He was basing this on his fear and misunderstanding about whether it's possible for a heterosexual male to receive sexual pleasure from a trans woman. So again, we talked about this before, but I think it bears repeating, is that his virulent homophobia and transphobia is getting the best of him at this point. Jose will knock on the door and ask what Madsen had found, who replies that Gwen hadn't shown him anything. Jose says Jason Caceres will go next into the bathroom. Again, this is according to Morel testimony. Jose will become more agitated. He says he goes outside for a smoke. He testifies that he threw up outside and was disgusted that he might be gay and what had transpired. He will go back into the house, and this is where Nicole Brown comes out of the bathroom and says that Gwen, quote, is a man, unquote. Jose testifies that this is when he breaks down and starts to cry. At this point, Nicole and Manny will try to console him while he's telling him that he can't believe he's gay. And again, this is right out of his testimony. He will testify that he said that he did not want to look at Gwen, and Nicole will tell Jose that Gwen should be allowed to go, at which point Jose said, get Gwen out of the house. He then will go to his bedroom and calm down. He'll come out a bit later. He doesn't really specify how long this is. And when he does, he sees Caceres, Madsen, and neighbors in the entryway to the house with Gwen. To him, it looks like that Gwen is trying to get out of the house, which again speaks to your point, Jessica, of her being kidnapped against her will and forcibly held in a house when she was trying to leave. At this point, Gwen is saying that they should let her go, or else she could have her Norteño family members come to the house and beat them up. If you're not familiar with the term Norteño is a gang in California, predominantly in Northern California. And I do want to mention, there is nothing ever mentioned in any of the research that I or any of us went through, or the court records, or any interview in a newspaper that I could find that has any connection between Gwen, her family, and the Norteño gang. But I do want to mention that I can, at that moment, totally understand why Gwen, fearing for her life, would grasp at straws and throw anything at these guys to hopefully scare them into letting her out of the house. Jose says that Gwen will try to slap Madsen, who wrestles her to the ground with one hand around her neck, while Caceres and neighbors and Jose all tell Madsen to let her go. So again, we're seeing that the fingers are starting to where in Caceres' version of the story, he's fully pointing the finger, I believe, at Jared Neighbors. Jose's version of the story is really pointing the finger at Michael Madsen at this point. Jose says Madsen will put his arm around Gwen's throat, and once again, Caceres has to pull him off, which is close to Jared Neighbors' version of the story. This is the time that Madsen and Neighbors both began to hit and slap Gwen. They were asking her if, quote, she thought this shit was funny, unquote. Jose will also testify that Caceres and Neighbors will yell, quote, knock that bitch out, unquote. At which point Madsen will punch her so that she, quote, stumbles against the wall, unquote. Now, he refers to a stumble against the wall. If you remember back to the coroner's report, Gwen had blunt force trauma to the back of her head, indicative with a lot more than just a stumble. In fact, Jared Neighbors will testify that she hit the wall so hard that the wall was actually dented from her skull. Jose will testify that he goes to the kitchen and brings back a can. He doesn't really hit her with it. Instead, he returns to the kitchen and brings back a frying pan. Jose says that he only brought it back so he could get Gwen to flinch. Like he would rear up and try to hit her, and she would flinch, and then he wouldn't hit her. He, however, says that Gwen will say she was sorry at this point, and he does follow through with hitting her with a pan. Although he says that I didn't mean to make contact with her or strike her hard. He says the pan just skipped off Gwen's head. That was really hard for me to read. And even to say it now, this idea that he's again, I think, reverting back to almost a small child of like, well, I didn't mean to do it. And speaking of the coroner's report, remember that said that one of the causes of death was potentially the blunt force trauma to her head with a large, heavy object. Jose will testify that Gwen will say again that she was sorry. Jose will say that he put the pan back in the kitchen. When he left, Gwen was sitting on the couch, but when he returned, she was lying face down, bleeding from her forehead, blood running down onto the carpet. He continues that Madsen and Neighbors were both standing over her, hitting her. Morel will say that he told them to stop. Madsen will ask what they should do, and Jose will suggest dropping her off at a corner where they normally picked her up. It was at this time that Jose begins to clean the carpet. And I find it fascinating the things that he focuses in on. Like, you know, he can remember with clarity putting back the pan or cleaning the carpet.
It's such hard testimony because I don't think we've had a case where the people themselves have told you what went on. But there's so much about what they did, and there's so little about the person they did it to.
Right.
And the experience and what she must have been going through. And so much of this is like, it feels like they're trying to explain away why they did it. You know, she deserved it or whatever was going through their heads. And yet this is a human being. It's really hard to listen to.
I agree. I think that piece of the testimony, I went back to cleaning the carpet.
Yeah.
You're beating a woman to death and you're concerned with a blood stain on a carpet.
Or that they can even think, well, we'll just take her to the corner.
Yeah, we'll drop her off.
After you hit her with a frying pan. I mean...
Oh, but he didn't mean to.
Right. It's the amount of the fear and what she must have been feeling must have been horrible.
And then while we're talking about it, too, realize that Gwen's family is in the courtroom again.
Yeah.
So not only have they had to deal with losing their daughter once and living through the last moments of her life in excruciating detail with pictures from the coroner the first time, but now they have to sit through another trial with the same details being read out aloud, and these people trying to justify their actions. It was at this time that Madsen is going to tie Gwen's hands and feet and suggest that they, quote, take her a little further, unquote. And these quotes are from, again, Jose Morel. Jose will think that he thinks that they're just going to drive her a little further than they normally do to drop her off. Jose will take another look at Gwen and go to the bedroom and cry. So it's almost like I'm burying the head in the sand. I wasn't in the room, so I'm not as at fault as these other people. 10 minutes, he will come back to the living room and begin cleaning blood from the rug. Gwen, Madsen, and Caceres were all gone. Jose will say that Madsen will enter the room and point out more blood spots that need to be cleaned and then leave again. 15 minutes later, Caceres will come back into the room and tell Jose that it was time to go. He says that at this point, he had no reason to believe that Gwen was dead until he saw her body in the back of the truck, wrapped up in blankets, with shovels sitting next to her. Jason Caceres will tell Jose that they have to get rid of the body, and it wasn't until on their way home later that Michael Madsen tells Jose that if they needed to answer questions from the police, Jose should say that Madsen had strangled Gwen with a rope in the garage. And Jose takes this to meaning that Michael Madsen actually had done that. He had strangled Gwen. There was a small dumbbell weight in the Morel house, and a few days later, Jaren neighbors suggest that Jose should check that for blood and to make sure they're completely cleaned up. So, much like Jason Caceres' testimony, I see Jose Morel throwing a lot more onus again on Jaren neighbors, but this time he says it's not just Jaren neighbors, it's Michael Madsen as well.
He does seem to be in all the testimony we've heard so far from these three people, I guess, a common element to a lot of the violence.
Right. Which brings up our last person that we're going to talk about, whose testimony, and as you said, Jessica, who seems to be really at the center of all of these. He was, I would say, I won't say the main instigator, but he was the focal point from Jaren Neighbors' original testimony. He features heavily in both Jason Caceres' testimony in the second trial and Jose Morel's testimony, and that is Michael Madsen. We'll now dive into the testimony of Michael Madsen, somebody who, like Jose Morel, was not heard from in the first trial, but as you said, Jessica, has been in the center of every version of the story that we've heard so far. Michael will testify also with having sex with Gwen sometime between 2 days and 2 weeks before her murder. He will say that he had oral sex with Gwen one time in the bathroom at the Morel house, and sometime later, Gwen will suggest having anal sex with Madsen, but he doesn't go through with it. It was the next day, according to Madsen, that he discussed the idea that Gwen was assigned male at birth with the others, especially since she gave him the same reason for no vaginal intercourse that she had given to Jose 10 or 15 days earlier. So much like Jose Morel, we get the first part of his testimony being wrapped up in this idea of her gender or her gender identity.
And a lot of like very specifics when they had sex, when they didn't, which I can only assume comes because they're being questioned by their defense attorney. So in a way, this is kind of their laying out of the defense of...
Exactly. This whole idea of the term that's thrown around is sexual deceival, or being sexually deceived, and it's laying the groundwork for the transpanic defense to bolster that idea up. I think it's interesting too that they're using this, even though we know from the last episode and reading Kluenfeld's letter to the editor. Well, it's his editorial piece talking about how the first jury really almost threw that out almost at the start, but their own hangups and their own homophobia and transphobia is so ingrained that they're saying that it's a reason why this happened. I'm justified in killing this person because I couldn't deal He did not recall the group questioning Gwen's gender at all. They had all talked about how she might prefer one type of sex over another. They will ask Paul Morel, who, again, according to Madsen, says that Paul will say, yeah, I had sex with her. So they're using Paul as kind of their scapegoat a little bit in this respect. Madsen will not recall any other discussion about Gwen's gender from then on and was confident that she was assigned female at birth.
Does Paul have sex with her and not know the difference between vaginal sex and anal sex? Or did he just not have sex with her and he said he did?
I don't think it's never really talked about. I believe when Paul testifies in the first trial, he says he never said any of that. He says, I never had sex with her.
Okay.
It's not. I tend to think it's somewhere in the middle. I think that it's completely plausible to me that a bunch of guys drinking and smoking weed and bragging, and they ask Paul an offhanded comment, hey, did you have sex with her? And he could have said, oh, sure, bragging about it.
I find this testimony interesting because they're all talking about how they've had these discussions about them all sleeping with her and having sex with her, and even into specifics about what that was and what kind. And yet they're all also saying they never talked about, what they thought she might have been born biological at birth. And yet in the last testimony, which was Jose's testimony, the minute he said that she was annoying him, it's the first thing he goes to, and things kind of devolve from there. So It seems clearly this was something they were thinking about, and yet they're all, and I understand they're trying to avoid that premeditation, but it seems sort of unbelievable that, yes, we've had all these conversations, and yes, that's the first thing that happened when we start hurting Gwen, but also we never spoke about it. Right.
So it just happened to be the very first thing that we pull out of thin air, that questioning her gender identity or her sex assigned at birth. I agree with you. It speaks of their...
And we know they at least discussed it a couple of weeks earlier when Nicole Brown and Gwen had a fight.
If you're to believe Jaron Neighbors' testimony, and I think in this case, I know Neighbors' testimony, there were holes in it. There were, he himself as a character witness, or almost a character witness, but as the main prosecution witness has some issues. But I think his testimony is probably the closest to the truth that we're going to get. I agree. I think that if you take that into account, they're already having these conversations at least 2 weeks before, and at the same time, 2 of the friends are having sex with her. If you're to believe that, I think the other issue is, all we have to go on is the word of 4 people that had a hand in killing a girl. We don't have any other corroborating evidence of whether Gwen ever actually had sex with any of these people. Michael Madsen will testify that on the afternoon of October 3rd, 2002, he would have been drinking and smoking marijuana along with his other friends, and was, in his words, quote unquote, pretty drunk. He would go on to Caceres' house in the evening and have more beer. The 4 men, himself, Jason Caceres, Jose Morel, and Jaron Neighbors, would join all together sometime later that afternoon and would go out to 2 bars somewhere between 9 and 10 p.m. They drank more beer and tequila around 2 a.m. and returned to the Morel house, which was kind of the usual routine for a Friday and Saturday night. They'd continue to smoke marijuana and drink more while playing dominoes. Gwen was already there and had sat at the table with them. She began to interrupt the game by taking the dominoes. It was then that Jose became angry and asked her why she wanted everyone to have anal intercourse with her and whether she was a man. Madsen will say that at first he didn't really take note of the question seriously. He kind of just blew it off. At some point after that, he understood that Jose was really angry and serious. It was then that he tried to get Gwen to answer, even though he says he still believed that she was assigned female at birth. The men told Gwen that she would have to prove to them that she was female, again in their words, or she would have to leave. He, Michael Madsen, would suggest that Gwen needed privacy and went with her to the bathroom, which right there is a huge difference between what we've talked about in some of the other testimonies, is that he's the calm and cool one, the collected. Oh, she'll show us. She just needs privacy. And if you guys remember in some of the other stories, the other versions of the story, he violently grabbed her and either took her in or somebody forced her in there. He will say that while they were in the bathroom, she performs oral sex on him while he heard Morel banging on the door and asking what he'd found out. Madsen will say he hadn't found anything yet, and he leaves the bathroom at this point to talk to Jose, leaving Gwen there. It was then that Nicole Brown went into the bathroom shortly after coming out screaming that she'd felt something in Gwen's pants. This is the point in the story where Michael Madsen will say that Nicole Brown is screaming that Gwen's a man.
I think this testimony is interesting because what he's describing when he's talking about taking Gwen into the bathroom, we know she hasn't been allowed to leave. We know through other testimony that was far more violent. And he's really describing kind of casually sexually assaulting her.
Yeah, I think this one is so much different than the other ones because of this. It's compared to Jose Morel's, where Jose Morel spends a lot of time talking about Gwen as a girl, and I thought she was a girl. You know, all this kind of, he gets really wrapped up on the sex part, and it is, to me, when reading this and Madsen is really trying to portray himself as kind of like, I'm just a regular guy. You know, we're all out, we're drinking. I mean, a lot of the testimony is like how much they've had to alcohol, how much weed they've smoked. You know, oh, she's being annoying at the table, and you know, I suggested that she just needed privacy, and you know, it's all good. It's all good. I led her to the bathroom. You're right, and when we've had at least three other testimonies, not including the first trial with Paul and Manny Morel's, as well as Nicole Brown's testimony about it being a lot more violent. And then, so he's almost, casually passing over this fact that, you know, but for all intents and purposes, and according to the law, it's a sexual assault.
With everything that they are saying, they're not saying they didn't do it, but they are trying to say, to me, I feel like a drunk driver hits someone, it's manslaughter. It wasn't first degree, second. They're trying to say how drunk they were. They're probably just trying to get a lesser charge.
Again, we've talked a lot about it over the course of these episodes, is that it's almost like they're trying to throw as much stuff at the wall as possible. And I would imagine if I was, and again, we're not lawyers, we're not experts, we're just people who have done research and read a lot about this case and others, but it's almost opening that door again for the jury to say, well, they were drunk and people do dumb stuff when they're drunk. And I think it's trying to put the jury's mind in a place where they could have that reasonable doubt of it. Like you said, Sean, it's not murder. They didn't have an intention of killing her, which again, we have other testimony saying that they had been talking about this. You know, they had been threatening before. And so
I think it's just hard because there's so little value in this testimony. And I think because we don't really get this very often where we hear people say it themselves. Like you're saying, Sean, they're trying to give reasons why they did things and, you know, hopefully someone will see it their way. But there's just so little value on the victim of this crime and on what she went through. And it's just hard to listen to and hear.
And this also kind of goes back to another part that we've talked a little bit about with this, is that, and you said it a second ago, Sean, is that none of them are saying they did it. They're all saying that they were there. And it's almost like a game of like hot potato or pass the buck, you know, of like, it's not my fault, though I wasn't there, it was somebody else's. I was the good guy. And like you just said, Jess, it's not, there's very little focus on the actual victim, and it feels like there's no remorse at all. It was a mistake. And again, it's that not accepting responsibility or culpability at all. Caceres, at this point, this is the point in Madsen's story where he says Caceres and Jose both try to enter the bathroom. He says Caceres has succeeded, again in there, closes the door behind him. Jose is banging on the door, all the while crying and yelling. Michael Madsen says that Jose is uncontrollable. He's crying. Manny and Madsen both try to console him. Again, he's trying to portray himself as the caring friend that's looking out for his buddy. At this point, Madsen will go outside with Jose, who vomits. Madsen will worry about Jose's emotional reaction and wants to prove that Gwen is a woman. So again, he's saying, I still think she's a woman, which it's not getting into his head that she is a woman. So he told Jose that he's going to go check Gwen's gender. This is already after admitting that he's had sex with her in the bathroom. He will testify that he did pin Gwen down on the floor while somebody else pulled her underwear aside. Oh, again, the barest moment of accepting responsibility. I pinned her down, but I wasn't the actual one who tore her clothes off. The next thing he says, as he recalls, is Gwen standing in front of him, yelling threats and saying that her family members who belong to the Norteño gang would come and, quote, in his words, shoot up the house and you guys are all dead, unquote. He wanted Gwen to stop shouting, so he grabbed her throat and pushed her against the wall, choking her out and shouting at her. Jose, Jason Caceres, and Jaron Neighbors, as well as Nicole Brown, are all present at this point in the story, in his story. Some will suggest, and again, he doesn't get really specific. He says, well, the idea was that knock Gwen out. And so he says, Michael Madsen, punch her in the face. She falls at that point into a sitting position, and he goes into his testimony about how angry he is. So again, as you said, Jess, it's how angry I am, not the action that took place or what was going on. He continues to testify about Jose at this point coming back in with a cast iron skillet and telling Madsen to watch out. Michael Madsen will pull Gwen's head down so Morel can hit her on the back of the head with a pan. Madsen will then have the impression that Morel was trying to knock her out, which I don't even know what to say. People have been watching too many cartoons, I know we see it in movies all the time, but I can't believe somebody actually would come in and bring in a frying pan and have the idea of like, that makes total sense of I'm going to knock this person out with this object.
Well, not just a frying pan, a cast iron skillet.
Yeah, it's
something much heavier than your normal.
Yeah, it's a huge heavy object. Neighbors will then hit her, after which Michael Madsen will see Neighbors had actually had a 5-pound weight in his hand. So again, we've talked about in the past that 5-pound weight with the blood on it coming back. It was then that Michael Madsen, Jose, and Neighbors will all beat Gwen. So this point, he actually does say, yeah, at this point, we beat her up. After an unspecified amount of time, Michael Madsen will see that Gwen is not responding and notices blood on the carpet. Madsen and Neighbors will both move her to the couch, and someone suggests making her walk home. Madsen wanted to keep her from screaming, so he asked for something to gag her with. Jose didn't have anything, so he went into Paul's room and got a do-rag, which he uses to gag Gwen. He says in testimony that he has no memory of tying up Gwen with rope, but did not doubt that he did it. He will say that Jaron Neighbors and him will carry Gwen into the garage so she would not bleed on the furniture and the carpet. They'd put a sheet under her because Michael Madsen says he didn't want any of the blood to get everywhere. He will go on to tell about realizing he was covered in blood and reacting with panic and shock. He will go to the bathroom and clean himself up. On his way back to the garage, he tells Jose to meet him outside. At this point, he says he asked Jaron Neighbors if Gwen had woken up, and he tells them that she's dead. So Michael Madsen asks Jaron, hey, has Gwen woken up? Jaron tells him no, she's dead, and that Jaron Neighbors, had killed her. Madsen panics, afraid that they will go to jail, and tells Jose to come with him to clean up the blood, while Neighbors and Caceres go out to get shovels. Madsen will then go to the garage and check for a pulse and finds none. He sees a rope around her throat, and they carry her out and put her in the bed of the truck. Then they return to their cleaning. Soon, Caceres and Neighbors return with shovels. Caceres asks if she is dead. Neighbors will hit her twice in the same area around her head and says, quote, she is now, unquote. He will testify that he told the group that if questioned, they should all say that he had killed Gwen because he did not have any children. He says that this is why he told police that he had put a rope around Gwen's throat. He was keeping He was keeping with the pact that all these guys had made. He would later decide not to take responsibility for the things that he had not done, and told the officers later that he was not the one who'd put the rope around her neck. Thoughts on Michael Madsen's version of the story, or takeaways? What is your after hearing that? If you were in the jury at that point and he finished his testimony, what would your initial feeling be?
To me, after hearing all these testimonies, just like what I was saying earlier, it seems like the defense lawyers might have got together to figure this all out, but they're making it say, look, they did it, but there's so many holes in the story, so many things you can think about, you have to give them like the least amount. Like, I feel like that's how all these testimonies are coming out.
Yeah, it gets to the point where it's really is, and I guess speaking a little meta, I know when I wrote this, and we've talked about it, and we've been working on this one for a while, that there were a few times where it got confusing between the three of us of like, what story are we on? Who did which? Who's saying they did? Even having to write down like a flow chart of, okay, this is this version of the story, and here's what the differences are. It gets confusing, and I think that's a good thought of maybe the defense did throw all of it to try to dizzy the jury a little.
It's just hard because I know there are differentiations between different kinds of murder. And, Sean, you were talking about manslaughter and, a drunk driver and an accident. And this just feels like, I don't know if it's doing all these episodes or what, but it's really hard to think that there's some sort of difference between if they planned it or if they didn't. It wouldn't change how violent and how awful and how horrible this is.
Right.
Or if this was just an assault. I mean, you're hitting someone with a frying pan while someone else is holding them down. And then your biggest problem is, oh no, there's blood on the carpet.
It's not just a frying pan, too. It's a weight. It's a rope. It's hitting with a shovel and saying, she is now. It's all the things that went on that it doesn't make it any better. Whatever they're saying makes everything worse.
Yeah. And I don't know how you decide. Any one of those blows could have been the killing blow because they're all so violent and they're all so terrible. And it's so hard, this one, to kind of like, to think a jury had to put them in order and think about who was more guilty or who was less guilty. And it doesn't make any sense. This is as violent and horrible as any of the crimes we've covered. Mm-hmm. And I know there are differences in some crimes, and this one, for whatever reason, I just can't see the delineations.
Well, and I think, too, this is one of the first cases that I remember us doing where we have multiple murderers, where the stories are all different, but not really. I mean, there are elements there. There's that Venn diagram of all three or all four of these stories, and there's some similarities and some divergences. On some of the other cases where we've had multiple assailants or multiple murderers, it's usually one narrative that's being pushed, and it's the one that's reported. Like, prosecution is pushing this narrative, and the defense is fighting that narrative with their own narrative. This is not. We have four different stories, and they all have some element of truth in them, and it is really hard to suss out what I would go with is like that's the version I actually believe the most. And I think that was, to me, when I got done reading all these and going over them and thinking about them and rewriting a couple of drafts of this and trying to get everything right in my head, I came to the conclusion for myself that none of them are 100% correct. None of them are the truth. I don't think. I even have a hard time. Jerry Neighbors isn't the most reliable witness. I think maybe I will say of any of them, I believe his probably the most, but I'm sure that is not the actual truth.
I think it is because we're hearing from their own words.
Right.
The kind of callousness.
Yeah.
And it's not like I expect, they're on trial, so they're not going to be totally open about how they feel. And I think a lot of people will focus on the fact that, after this they had breakfast and that's really callous. But from the moment, there's not a single moment where they treat Gwen like a person. Best case scenario, they hold down a person and she turns out to be exactly who it is they want her to be. That's still an assault. They treat her from the moment one, the first step, as the thing that doesn't matter more, that's, as important or more important than, how you're feeling. And I'm not asking them to feel any certain way, but they could have walked away. It just, I don't know.
In that callousness, it really struck a chord too, especially when, it will be an upcoming case on a Jane Doe that you actually cover.
Yeah.
Jess, is there a connection to this that got caught of just this certain kind of, like you said, this callousness of not seeing the victim as a human. One of the things was Michael Madsen talking about him being covered in blood, realizing that and being shocked at that. Like, you spent the last couple hours victimizing another human being, and then suddenly you're like, oh my God, I'm covered in blood.
Hello all, my name's Paul and I'm the creator and host of the True Crime Enthusiast podcast, a show that looks at and recounts a variety of cases from the shores of the UK. Some are solved, some are unsolved, but they always tend to be the more obscure and unfamiliar. On the True Crime Enthusiast podcast, you'll find tales ranging from teenage vampires to sex-crazed killer farmers, from exorcisms gone wrong in the most extreme manner to the most horrific mask-wearing maniacs that you can imagine. Each tale is as true as the sky is blue, and the UK claims the lot. So if you're intrigued, then why not join me each week as I trawl through the archives for these and much more. You can find me on iTunes, Spotify, and pretty much wherever you grab your shows from. So I hope you can join me and become enthusiastic about the True Crime Enthusiast podcast.
So there is one other thing that I just want to briefly mention that comes up during the trial. One of the Bay Area newspapers will cover a story that during this trial, Michael Madsen's interview it's taped, and it will be played during the trial. And their supposition is that Madsen is coached by the police detectives to use the transpanic defense in his defense when he's arrested. There is no other mention of this. I looked into it. No other news source carries this. It is I won't say a throwaway piece, but it's a part of a much larger article. It's not reported out, and there's no other follow through. So I really think that this is something that's kind of almost like a Hail Mary. Like the defense is throwing this in there and say, well, it's not, look, the police are coaching him. They're trying to throw more, more oil on the fire to try to get the blame shifted from the murderers to somebody else. During the closing arguments, Jason Caceres' defense lawyer, again, J. Tony Serra, from the first trial would argue that these three defendants were, quote, ordinary human beings, unquote. He goes on to argue that at most they should be charged with manslaughter, since this was, as he puts it, quote, a classic state of heat of passion, unquote. He will also close with the point of Caceres taking no active part in the killing of Gwen.
Out of all those testimonies, that's the farthest from my mind, that it was like a heat of passion killing. Like, I didn't see that at all from any of it. I know what he's trying to explain, but it didn't feel like that at all.
I'm with you. I don't see at any point of this is that this is a heat of passion crime. It's, I'm angry, I'm going to take it out on you, and I'm going to punish you for something that I feel is wrong. I mean, they talked about it. If you're to believe Jared Neighbors, they've been having this conversation for weeks. Even if you don't believe him, like you mentioned earlier, Jess, they had every opportunity to stop, but they didn't. They planned it. They planned the disposal. It's a hard one for me to even contemplate a heat of passion defense. And again, like we said, we're not experts in the law, but I do know that if I was sitting on the jury, that wouldn't have entered in my mind at all. Chris Lamiero, the chief prosecutor for both the first trial and the second trial, will again push for first-degree murder charges. But this time, he will give the jurors the option of a second-degree murder charge conviction of all three men, and even actually give them a manslaughter option for Jose Morel. In his closing statement, he will ask for first-degree murder convictions on both Madsen and Caceres, with Madsen as being the main culprit. He goes so far as to call Madsen, quote, a poor excuse of a man, unquote, with a, quote, stupid and moronic, unquote, list of excuses for killing Gwen. It was on September 8th the jury had announced that it had reached a verdict after a week of deliberation on 2 of the 3 defendants. The judge in this case, Harry Shepard, issued an order that the verdict would be kept secret. It would not be until September 12th that the verdict would be read in court. Michael Madsen and Jose Morel were each convicted of second-degree murder. There was a deadlock on Caceres with a 9-3 vote on convicting him of murder. None of the men were convicted of hate crime enhancement allegations. The San Francisco Chronicle would carry another article where a juror, this juror was named Max Stern, who at the time lived in Piedmont, California, which is a small suburban city located within Oakland. In his interview, he outlines why the jury voted as they did. They will reject the transpanic defense against almost again at the outset. And I think this is another indication where maybe not being in the jury room, people might, because I know after reading that the first verdict from the first trial, I immediately thought, oh, it's the transpanic defense. They got to him. Same with this one. Well, like, why isn't it first degree murder? It's got to be the transpanic defense. And I think him elocuting that right away and saying, no, we threw that out of the way almost at the start. He will state, and a quote, this is not manslaughter because it is not reasonable to accept this behavior in response to the circumstances here. This is not confronting the molester of your children or somebody who raped your spouse. These events devolved into a brutal beating and homicide, unquote. When asked about the hate crime enhancement, he said that it was due to some of the jury believing that the killing was not necessarily because of her being a trans woman, but rather, quote, to cover up a situation that had gotten out of control. He continues on that even if the men had been, in his words, quote unquote, sexually deceived, as they had claimed, that there was no reason for the actions of killing of Gwen Arajuo. Stern will say that the jury did their job in a very professional and cooperative way, even though there were an emotional and stark times throughout the process. It was Morel and Madsen's own testimony that was the final nail in the coffin for the jury, according to Stern, when it came to striking Gwen in the head. He will also state in the article that he believed it was Madsen that was the one who strangled Gwen in the end. The hard part was what to do about Jason Caceres. According to Stern, quote, there's no factual information that he had committed any of the violence on the victim, unquote. He will say that he believed that all of the defendants lied on the stand at some point. As to the truthfulness of neighbors, Stern will say that they had doubts about his testimony as well, but in the end, if it had not been for his help with the initial investigation, then it's possible that Gwen would never have been found in the first place and there'd be no justice at all for her in any way. Prosecutor Lemire would comment that after the trial that, quote, Gwen being transgender was not a provocative act. It was who she was. However, I would not further ignore the reality that Gwen made some decision in her relation with these defendants that they were impossible to defend. I don't think most jurors are going to think it's okay to engage someone in sexual activity knowing they assume they have one sexual anatomy when you don't, unquote. This is the quote that really got to me. He comes so close to understanding and avoiding victim blaming and then takes a header right into it. You know, during this trial we had talked about before, he uses Gwen's name. He doesn't dead name her. By this point, Gwen's mother had Gwen's name legally changed to Gwen. But then right at the end, he's like, yeah, you know, these guys are reprehensible. They did this terrible crime. But had she not been hanging around and acting the way she would, she might not have ended up this way. And that was a really hard pill for me to swallow. The truth is that none of us can know what Gwen was going through in the years leading up to her murder. Only Gwen did. I understand not understanding what she did or putting herself in such situations, but to say that her actions were impossible to defend, no one except someone that has gone through what Gwen was experiencing could possibly know or understand what led her to do the things that she did. None of that matters, though. And none of it is an excuse for four men and a group of bystanders to stand around and murder a woman that was only looking for acceptance from those around her and was struggling with something that most people would never be able to handle or understand. Michael Madsen and Jose Morel will be sentenced in January to 15 years to life in prison for second-degree murder. At the sentence, Morel will express deep regret to Gwen's family. Madsen, on the other hand, will only express anger at the verdict and sentence. According to Judge Shepard, he never once expresses any regret for his actions in the murder of the young woman, which only leaves the fate of Jason Caceres. He will again be in front of the court in December and enter a plea of no contest to voluntary manslaughter and will be sentenced to 6 years in prison. You want to explain what no contest meant?
So from the site souselaw.com, it says that no contest, it means I do not wish to contest. And it's the same as a guilty plea. You're not technically saying you're guilty, but you're still allowing the court to determine your punishment. So it's kind of like there's no way around it, but you can say no contest and actually instead of it just seems like it's wording. Yeah, I'm guilty, but I'm going to say no contest to make it sound like I didn't say I'm guilty.
Right, because I think in essence, it is the technicality of saying I never actually pled guilty to the crime. I pled no contest. I don't agree with being held guilty, and I'm not going to admit it, but I'm going to allow the court to punish me for a crime that I'm not admitting I did. Caceres actually will decline to comment to the media after the sentencing was over, but his defense attorney, J. Tony Serra, will maintain that he never once denied that he was involved, just the level of involvement was in question. This no contest plea does mean that they cannot use this against Caceres in the future of a civil trial. So if Gwen's family wants to go after them in civil litigation, this no contest can't be used against them in that. Caceres will ask the judge to delay his prison sentence until he can be there for the birth of his third son. The prosecutor will say that at the time, it'd be hard to entertain this idea since Gwen was dead and the Caceres was involved. But this request will be granted and he will enter into prison after the birth of his child. Both Morel and Madsen will appeal the decision of the California Court of Appeals. The appeal was made on the grounds that the prosecutor did not instruct the jury correctly on the charges and how they were to be proceeded. So again, they're trying to use a legal loophole or legal technicality. There was also an argument made that when they were giving instructions to the jury about the, quote, heat of passion defense, unquote, that the jury should have been told whether an ordinary reasonable person would have been liable to act rashly, not whether such a person would act rashly. So that's a really fine hair to split there. What they're saying is the instructions really should have been, could somebody have acted rationally, not would they have acted rashly. As well as some of the other comments made by prosecutors to the jury they took exception to, the 3-judge panel would deny the appeals and the judgment would stand. Jaron Neighbors would serve his 11-year prison sentence and eventually get released sometime before 2016. Couldn't find an actual, more specific release date other than that. And Jason Caceres would be released in July of 2012. Jose Morel would go out for parole and be released in 2016. At this time, Sylvia Guerrero, Gwen's mother, would say that she'd been in contact with the Morel family and for a while preceding his release, and that she, Gwen's mom, would believe that Jose had always been very remorseful for the killing of her daughter. However, by the end of 2019, this would change. In a phone interview with a Bay Area reporter, Sylvia Guerrero would say that she changed her mind about Jose and his remorse. She goes on to say that the only reason why he showed his remorse was in order to get a lighter prison sentence and to get out on parole. Michael Madsen would be denied parole in 2016. His parole hearing would be contested by Gwen's mother. In September of 2019, he would again be denied parole. He would, for the first time since the killing, accept responsibility for Gwen's murder. In fact, he would take all of the blame for her murder, going so far as to say that he was the one that strangled her and that he could have saved her, but he chose not to. Sylvia, however, would not attend this hearing. Instead, her younger sister, Lupe Downing, would represent the family. Ms. Downing would then give a statement to the press, quote, "He didn't just kill her. It was disgusting what he did to her over so many hours," unquote. Sylvia would be interviewed by Bay Area News and would say that she believed that Madsen was only admitting guilt in order to be released from prison and to stand a chance of parole. His parole actually is denied at this point, and Madsen will be expected to have another trial in 2024. Before we go on, I kind of wanted to ask your thoughts on the parole outcomes and even Sylvia Guerrero's change of mind about Jose Morel's pleading for clemency.
I just think because we've talked about loved ones and parents in particular in some of our other episodes, just the idea that she has to keep going to these things, every few years, keep that going. It's just, that's unbelievable, that kind of trauma that she has to keep reliving all of the time.
And it's anytime we talk about, especially these capital offenses where someone's lost their life, that question of at what point legally have you paid your debt to society and should be released. I'm glad I don't have to make that decision, because I don't know if I would be able to be open to the possibility that any of these guys should ever walk free.
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation. I don't know, because I know what I can feel, but then they did go through the process of a trial, 2 trials. This was what the outcome came. So
right.
It might not be what everyone wanted, but it's hard to question it because you're hoping that the justice system works.
Right. And so many times, and it's not just this case, I think a lot of times we've talked about it where a verdict comes out and you're like, well, that doesn't seem fair. Like that's all they got, or really, or in some cases, I know even in some of the cases that we haven't quite covered yet, but are on our list that we've talked about, I can't believe the person got that long, for that offense, or, why would this person be jailed even based on what kind of evidence they had? So it's always a difficult conversation, especially the sentencing, I think, and more than a lot of other elements of when we research some of these stories. Gwen's death will bring about change, however, but it has been at a very slow pace. Close to the time when her body was found, a group called Transvision was started, which operated out of the Tri-Valley Health Center in Alameda County. Transvision is a program that works with transgender patients, providing a wide range of counseling and medical help. They provide care regardless of financial status or medical history. This is a place that helps those like Gwen who are searching for help and support when dealing with something beyond their control and could go to get support and help that they need. It is a shame that this came too late to help Gwen, but hopefully in some ways this can help other people from suffering the hatred, bigotry, and violence, as well as keeping them from being murdered as what happened to Gwen. On the first anniversary of Gwen's death, this group also created a Gwen Arajuo Memorial Fund for transgender education. The primary purpose was to help with secondary school programs that can help transgender youth and with education outreach to help educate young people on these issues. Sylvia Guerrero and her family also helped with this group, Sylvia herself going out to local schools to talk about Gwen and to help with education and awareness process. We'll be posting all of this information on our website, californiatruecrime.com, on the Gwen Arajuo page. It was in September of 2006 that the governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, signed the Gwen Arajuo Justice for Victims Act, or AB 1160, into law. This law would limit the use of criminal defendants from using gay or trans panic defense. Now jurors would be instructed to not let bias influence their decisions, including biases around sexual orientation and or gender identity. Which, it's a great law. It's just shocking that you would have to put that in of like, please don't let your bias dictate how you're looking at it or acting as a juror. This would also declare, contrary to the public policy, for defendants to be acquitted or convicted of lesser offenses based on the appeals to social bias. In this case, the bias against trans community. In September of 2014, California Governor Jerry Brown signed into law Assembly Bill 2501. This went even further and restricted the use of the gay and trans-panic defense by changing the manslaughter laws to forbid the defense by defendants who are claiming that they were provoked after discovering their victim's sexual orientation or gender identity. This was introduced by Assemblyperson Susan A. Bonilla along with Equality California, which is a nonprofit organization that works with LGBTIA rights in California. When the bill was announced, it cited the murders of Gwen Arajuo and Larry King, another trans teen who was killed by a classmate. On a sadder note, Sylvia Guerrero, who at the time of her daughter's death was working as a paralegal, is currently homeless as of the recording of this episode. She has stated that she had left her job because of what happened to her daughter and has suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the murder, which is something you had talked about earlier, just with this constant having to make sure that her daughter's not forgotten, to make sure that the justice is done, and being a constant reminder, aside from the fact that she's dealing with the murder of her child. She's been left unable to work and started a GoFundMe account to help her pay for expenses and to continue her work in spreading the education and understanding about trans issues. Before we go on with kind of closing out this episode, I want to give you guys an opportunity to say any final words or thoughts about what we've covered over this last 5 episodes. I know this has been a really tough one. I know for me, we've been working on these episodes, this case in these 5 episodes for, I think, almost a year, if not a little longer, as far as researching and writing. And so...
Yeah, I think also we had to take breaks in there because of certain things. So it just, for us, this was a long one to record, even only 5 episodes. But this one is just really difficult because there's just so much. It brought up so many conversations between the 3 of us talking about things. It doesn't feel like justice. It doesn't feel like anything happened. It's still gross feeling constantly to me. And it's just a hard one to... It's always hard when laws are changed or written because of something horrible happening. And to be in this year and still feel like there's so much further to go, it's reading this, it's just hard.
Yeah, I for me, that was one I kind of flipped back and forth. Like I had to keep checking the date a few times early on of like early 2000s. Certainly it can't be just that. And then, like we've talked about before, almost 20 years ago. And then that part of my brain going, well, would the outcome be different today? I'd like to say it would, but I really don't. I don't know if it would. I think we're still fighting a lot of those biases. We're still fighting a lot of that bigotry, and I'm hoping it's better, but I think we like you said, Sean, we have a long way to go. And again, this is not, we've said this before, this is not our story. We're trying to do the best we can by being as respectful as possible. So
I think for me, because we haven't covered a case where I can say, oh, the murderer really treated that victim like a human being. Yeah. But we're always looking for ways that we can, I don't know, or I can myself change things or think about things differently. Right. And I think, like Sean is saying, we live at a time where it's great that these laws are in California and that they've passed. There's still a lot of work to be done in other states and federally, and a lot of new bills being passed that are discriminatory and don't treat people with the respect as human beings that they deserve, and lots of fights about how we speak to each other. To me, this is a reminder that that's a super important fight. Even if it seems dumb to you, treating people like you respect them and like they're human can change how people like this might see that person in the future, and hopefully help protect people against not just something as horrible as this, but, we talked about the statistics, the everyday violence that trans people experience.
Gwen Arajuo was a 17-year-old girl. She was loved by her family and friends, who all say that she had a sparkling personality and a love for life that was shown through the hardships, bigotry, and hatred that she had to endure. Her dream of getting away from living the life that she wanted, not only as a makeup artist, but as a woman, was taken from her when her life was cut short and a shadow would forever be cast over her friends and family for the joy they had lost. I'd like to close with a quote from Sylvia, Gwen's mother, about what life was like after Gwen. Quote, "If I've learned anything since Gwen's murder, it is that hope alone is not enough. Each of us who hopes to live in a state where our families are protected need to work towards making California that place. For instance, boys and girls in schools throughout the Bay Area need to hear firsthand how important it is to be themselves and to respect each other's differences. None of us can change the way the world was on October 4th, 2002. But each of us now has an important role to play in creating a state where we can celebrate more birthdays and commemorate fewer murders." If you or someone you love is dealing with issues related to being trans, there are people who can help. Contact the National Center for Transgender Equality at transequality.org. Take the time to reach out and help end the hate and bigotry.